Hello, and welcome back once again to the Inquisitor podcast. Today, my guest is Peter Wheeler. You've probably heard him one or two times before. Today, we're going to be talking about the death of the apprenticeship and how that has rippled through into the performance that we're seeing today and what we can do to bring back some of the benefits. So, without any further ado, Peter, welcome. And would you mind giving 60 seconds on your plotted history?
My history, serial entrepreneur. I've been across many different industries from automotive through SaaS. Within SaaS, it's been cybersecurity, geospatial, a lot of different things, patents, and serial salesperson as well. That happens from being an entrepreneur, as well as being a sales manager in various industries. And right now I am running a podcast called Pitch Slap that does best practices talks with people that are experts in their space, and a firm called Revelocity, where we focus on revenue velocity for organizations, specializing in solopreneurs, small teams, and pre-seed round organizations to make sure they can have and sustain their hockey stick growth. So there we go.
Excellent. Okay, well, let's start with the first question, which is where do you see the death of the apprenticeship most clearly affecting sales today?
Effectiveness. You jumped right in, buddy. It's
We're-
affecting sales in effectiveness. Uh, the I guess if we step back, the lack of apprenticeship also has to do with this siloing of roles inside of sales teams. And I'm happy to see pods at least coming together with that breakup of what a sales role is. But it's very rare to see a prospecting AE that is thriving because organizations don't support that really. They ask for it, but they don't support it. So now we have these XDR teams that are doing different types of inside and outside outreach and prospecting. And then AEs that are going in and closing and or account management. Sometimes we have account managers as opposed to account executives. We have solutions people that are actually doing the important part with the customer and figuring out where the value is. So I think that there's just no opportunity for apprenticeship unless it's in a specialized field. And I don't think the specialized fields work together enough to be effective, nor do they stay somewhere long enough to be effective. So effectiveness.
Well, to go on our first rabbit hole, I think one of the other problems is the prevalence of player managers who are really supervised players, and you can't do both jobs well. So you end up falling into supervisory, which is essentially dealing with reporting and trying to kick people around to get them to meet the KPIs. But if you have a target, you're going to focus on that. And so things like coaching get sacrificed, especially as the end of the quarter approaches rapidly. So I'm curious about your thoughts on player managers.
I have no issue with a player manager that is a player manager that's out in the field. So the player managers that we're seeing now, or that we understand that term as being, are the ones that are quota carrying account people that on top of it are supposed to compete with the people they're supporting. I guess is that's a decent way of phrasing it, as opposed to shadowing, or one of my less favorites is leading, where they micromanage or they come in and they see something going sideways and they just step in as opposed to supporting. But yeah, the player manager, and there's no way, it's hard enough to balance a book of business. It's hard enough to manage people. It's two separate roles. And I know I'm being contradictory to what I just said, but a manager is a manager, and they have obligations to lead, to support, to instruct, to grow the people underneath them. And then there are the players, the account people, who are executing on what that manager expects.
Well, once you get over five people on your team, that is just a full-time job managing them. And routinely, I'm seeing people with six, seven, eight, even 12, and they also carry a quota. And that's just bound to be a recipe for disaster, either for the individual who will burn out, or they will adopt the policy of rescuing because it's easier if I do it myself. So then they suffer from upward delegation, and then that triggers burnout. And it also means that they have less clarity because they're working silly hours, their minds are fogged, and they're stressed. And chances are they're not really going to coach. They'll tell, that's not coaching. They'll rescue, and in many cases, they come in and they close the deal and steal the glory. And I think one of the big problems is every time you answer one of your reps' questions, you steal a learning opportunity.
That stepping in point you made is a very important one. It is easier and more expedited to just do the work for someone else. But that is where the apprenticeship dies. Because if you had a good sales manager, even if you had the full title, you're still in an arena to learn. So I think apprenticeship in the way that most people would understand it isn't how it would apply today. So maybe the concept of apprenticeship needs to be more around letting leaders lead and not putting them in the field. Having an understanding of the field should be an expectation. So that's on sites, that's shadowing, that's war rooms or murder boards, whatever you want to call them, doing those types of endeavors, having a hand in sales enablement, going and doing field marketing, but getting that managerial slog, writing OKRs, performance reviews, all that other stuff is just, it takes up all the time. And you either resent the organization, which causes that burnout, or you resent the helpless people who you made helpless underneath you, and it burns them out and it burns yourself out.
Well, in 17 years of employment, so I'm now 35 years into my career, so just under half of it, I was employed. And in all that time, I had one ride along with my manager. One. Now, first of all, he couldn't observe me in the field. All he ever saw was me on the phone. Um, and all those other managers, because there are a fair number of them over the years, never did any of the stuff that a good journeyman or artisan would do with their apprentice. And unless we have somebody to see as a role model, we're going to do what was done to us, or we're going to do what we think is right. And then when we get balled out on it because we've got it wrong or we create a downstream problem, then we get the blame. And I think so many salespeople, and I don't blame managers for this. I blame the dysfunction that is systemic. And it starts with the money behind the business because their values and their ethos permeate everything that's beneath them. And boards looking at, and CFOs looking at the balance sheet and going for efficiency over efficacy and effectiveness. So that ripple effect seems to have become the norm, and we've accepted it. And I think we've now got two generations who don't know how to transfer knowledge. The management layer and the sales layer, and neither of them have exposure to anybody unless they get an external coach or they work with peers who is capable of helping them see how to get better. So when you look at sales teams, there must be a moment where you think no one's ever actually taught this lot how to sell or to manage. What are the trigger points that you see that give you the indication that actually this is a company or a go-to-market function in trouble? What are the clues?
It truly comes down to clarity. And by that, I mean the communication clarity. We can tell people what their metrics are, what their goals are, where they're slipping. We can provide feedback. But if we don't know where the other person stands, what they're doing, details in the deal, you're talking about 17 years ago. Back when I was doing it then, and I'm dating myself, you would party line it as a manager or even as another salesperson. You'd pick up another extension, you'd tap into their line and you'd listen in on their calls. You can still do that with all the modern tools. You could go back and do gong reviews, which was not something that we had back then, and provide real support, real feedback, real communication, and real clarity around the deals instead of these nebulous hypotheticals. And you hit on 2 points in what you just said. The first one is probably the one that causes the most harm, but it's the one that's been around the longest amount of time. That's that whole shareholder primacy scenario. An organization's obligation is to the investors and not to, and I'm going to use one of your favorite words, human capital inside of an organization. And then the other part of it is, sure, we get these peer environments, but it's Lord of the Flies. You have a group that isn't experienced in the situation they're in usually, and that's why we're talking about journeyman or apprenticeship or studious environments, Padwans, if you want to really geek out with it, that are facing the same struggles and have the same end objective and no way to achieve it in an environment where they're pitted against each other. How are you going to have any level of clarity, communication, honesty, growth, teamwork? I love going into sales teams where there's competitive measurements on the board, visible competitive measurements, because that automatically proves it's not a team. It's a league of many individual player teams.
So that's one good indicator that sellers and managers are being set up to fail. What are the other clues?
Sales leadership that has never been in the field. that's never sold the product, hasn't been in the field in some time, that doesn't involve themselves in technology meetings, in product meetings, that doesn't involve themselves in enablement and marketing. Sales leadership that's the first to point. Now, marketing is always to blame. That's marketing has chosen that role, but defaulting to it. It's not enough hype. God, I hate that phrase. Hate it so much. You can't, as a leader, just wildly point to the problems without making any type of effort to remedy them yourself. And it's funny because when they want you to do executive speak, it's not about raising a red flag. It's about raising a red flag and providing solutions or actions that you're taking to do it. And with a lot of modern sales leadership, I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing the type of behavior you would expect from someone in a very junior role. So for me, that's a very major red flag.
Well, I think the absence of specific activities is really key. And one thing that baffles me is so often we hear that it's sales jobs to spend time in front of the customer. But I want to throw a curveball out there. I think it's the CFO's job. I think it's the CMO's job. It's the CRO's job. It's the VP of sales. It's the VP of customer service. They all need to be out in front of the customer. Product needs to be in front of the customer. Strategy needs to be in front of the customer. And when I go into organizations and I ask the question, when was the last time you actually spoke to the customer? The senior people haven't in years, possibly even in decades. And that really is problematic. They might get wheeled out for negotiating the big deal, where they more often than not end up being the chief discounting officer, if I'm being perfectly blunt. But they don't really have their finger on the pulse. So they're getting third party information at best. And um, I look at Toyota, and they have this concept of going to the Gemba, which means that you walk the floor and you spend a day in a circle for 8 hours observing how the production line works. Um, Very few of the senior leadership are getting their hands dirty enough and seeing how things actually operate, speaking to the people closest to the problem or closest to the effect of the problem. And so they're making decisions on the basis of what rolls uphill. And if you've ever tried to run a forecast, you know that a lot of that is fiction and it's theatrics. So, how do we deal with this? Because we're going into a very difficult trading period. The stock market may be booming, but about 50% of that is because of buybacks by 8 companies. So, that feels to me like a bubble, like 2008 and 2019 and 2001 and 1990.
Okay, so you identified a cycle and a problem, but if the people in those roles, those leadership roles, wanted to interact with the customer, they would have gotten into sales. And so getting them into a comfort zone of interacting with customers, getting them into to understand the budgeting of both their time and expense to interact with customers and the end value that they'd get out of it. Nobody has that job. Nobody does that job. Nobody spends the time making it happen. So why would they? And it's very rare that I come to the defense of leadership. Now, on the other side of it, though, I've been around, I've been in a lot of organizations where the executive team does interact with the customers, but it's always executive sponsors for crisis response.
Mm.
It's defend and deflect roles, nothing proactive. It is anti-churn motions, nothing proactive. And that's the hard part. And as a salesperson that gets all this stuff, you're role limited. Like sales roles don't have like this growth trajectory and path that many other roles have. The best a salesperson can do is face the punishment of being a sales manager. You take a pay cut, you're now producing and supervising. You're dealing with high turnover. You're dealing with unrealistic metrics. Those metrics, like you said, are all over the place. And it doesn't matter the team. Revenue numbers, sure, we always attribute revenue number issues that sales has to deal with that. But things that people don't keep in mind, and this goes into where you were talking about, it's important for executive team leaders to be on the floor for production, be on the floor for sales interactions, be on the floor for marketing interactions, because issues, let's say product roadmaps change. Sales is usually the last to know, and sales has usually made promises on changed product roadmaps. engineering switches, funding switches, anything you'd see out of the various teams. Legal switches. What countries do we operate in now? What's embargoed? What's not embargoed? What groups are in vogue for social status? Who is a dangerous category to touch? Like, sales is usually the last to know. And because the sales process is a lot longer, even if your deal velocity is a matter of a couple weeks, there's still enough time for any of those other teams to make a much more nimble and rapid change that affects what you're working on and what you produce.
Well, that speaks to the fact that most of organizations are siloed, and because they're siloed, they're generally targeted on all sorts of different metrics that are often conflicting. And you only have to look at the usual adversarial battles that go on between sales and marketing, IT and finance. Well, finance and everybody, if I'm being blunt, and operations and sales, and product and sales, and product and marketing. And if they were all working towards one objective, which is customers for life, as opposed to meeting this quarter's quota, what would be different?
It's not exactly a fair question because I think every organization makes the effort to do that with my
Every
least, my two least favorite acronyms. TAM, which everybody wants to operate against, which is completely unrealistic, and OKRs. And those OKRs, company-wide and team-wide, are supposed to provide that alignment and that clarity and that planning to hit what you want to hit. Now, I have yet to truly see an OKR environment where they all align. That's fine. Because of the siloing, it makes it difficult. But where OKRs are done accurately and in a timely fashion where you can actually execute on them before you have to write your next set of OKRs. And I think it goes back to the primacy issue. If we had communication clarity and we had one goal, which is customer joy, then everybody else's job is easier.
Well, I'm going to take the slight issue, in that in the 25 years I've been doing this, I can honestly say that I haven't seen that sort of clarity or alignment anywhere. And it stems from, I think, a lack of understanding of the real job to be done. We exist because of, not in spite of, the customer. They're not an inconvenience to be shoved at the end of a long chain of abuse. Shareholder value, and I'm going to absolutely build on your point there. Shareholder value is comes last in my book, because it's a symptom, it's a byproduct of ensuring that the customer gets the outcome that they hired when they rented your solution. And if we started with the customer at the heart of everything that we do, then we might be able to align everybody around common purpose. But as things stand at the moment, the common purpose is keeping the shareholders happy so that they can extract more value and exit, leaving behind a shell. Because in most cases, and I'm not saying all, but in many cases, private equity has a policy of find it, fuck it, flip it, and fuck off. And that's their business model. They're not building businesses. What they're building are financial instruments. And that is significant because it doesn't create the conditions where the people who face the customer, who produce the product, who service the customer after they bought, are rewarded, recognized, or compensated or promoted for creating retention. And what we know is that if you protect, expand, and then win your existing base, and you win as third in line instead of fixating on new logos as the prime objective, you get to keep a lot more profit. Your costs go down, your retention goes up, your churn decreases, your EBIT improves. And these are all things that people are measured on, but we seem to have built a business model based on metrics porn. That means that we're trying to be busy fools. Enough is enough, surely.
The difference between busyness and business. But you
Yeah.
have to remember that the long-term executive leadership team members are the ones that hit the checklist. And I agree with you completely. Shareholder value should be the effect, not the cause, not the driver. But then, like, because they're in charge, let's just admit that because they're in charge, because they need that rapid result, the Death of the apprenticeship is the death of mobility. It's the depth of growth. It's the death of um, realizing those tangible results you just outlined that are accomplished in years 2, 3, 4, 5. Nobody sticks around for that. They can't. And I know, roll your eyes at me, but in sales, this isn't new, buddy. You know that. Working the list, you people. Let's go into automotive again. They hire kids that are looking for a quick buck. They can get a quick buck selling one or two cars to their cousin and their grandma, and then month two hits and they can't sell anything because they weren't trained. They don't know. The organization won. They got customers. They have a salesperson that they don't have to worry about that washed out, and they're maintaining those customers in the book of business that are not holding a grudge because that person just couldn't do the job. It wasn't like they used that person. They just didn't let that person, they didn't support them. And there was no expectation of that. It's
But
not new.
the short-term win isn't a win. It's a problem that you're exporting and moving downstream, and you're going to pay a heavy price later. And if Todd Capone is listening to this, history tells us exactly that this is wrong, because the tenure of salespeople is typically about 12 months. Phil McGowan, when he completed his PhD on sales, um, found that the typical salesperson will hit their full stride in a specific role in year 3.2. What that means is no one ever hits full stride. They're barely at a third of full pace. And so that creates a downstream problem because now you've got recruitment costs, replacement costs, you've got to put them on a PIP, you've got to manage them, you've got to manage them out. You probably have legal costs, you have HR costs that are all preventable. Recruitment is the single most important function of any manager. And if you're a player manager who doesn't have an apprenticeship under your belt, then chances are you're going to treat recruitment as a chore, as an interruption to your busy day job. Whereas in fact, if I look at companies that were incredibly successful historically, like parametric technology, for example, 25% of a manager's bonus was based on their ability to recruit. And I look at Tom Schodorf's team over at Splunk. They spent a good amount of their time focused on creating an environment where people stayed. And the net result of that was they did really well. So I've got to take issue with the idea that it has to be that way. In the past, except for the last 30 years or 40 years, it hasn't been that way at all. Sales was actually treated like a profession. And people stayed with companies for a long time because there wasn't a revolving door. And that revolving door is exceptionally expensive and batters the balance sheet and damages shareholder value. And it allows behavior like the belief that a 97 to 99% failure rate is gold standard. If you had a doctor who the last time they looked at a medical journal was in 1987 and they were about to operate on you, you'd probably want a second opinion. Well, most salespeople with 20 years experience have 1 year's experience 20 times over because they haven't evolved. And that's because they don't have management, they don't have leadership that allows them to grow and develop unless they choose to do that themselves. Now, I do believe that it is our personal responsibility to grow and develop, but the company also has an obligation to create the conditions for us to be able to learn.
So I guess what I'll lead with was I wasn't saying that that's universally how it's been. I've just said it's existed. It's
Okay.
existed.
I take
But
it back then.
no, it's okay. It's okay. Tete-a-tete with you is one of the few joys I have in life. The you had outlined sales having once been a profession, and like those were careful words. But then you talked about doctors, and I spent a decade in risk management, professional liability, the doctor world. Spent a similar amount of time in legal. Those are let's just call them dignified professions, where continuing medical education is a requirement to
Yeah.
keep your license
Yeah.
to practice. Same thing with continuing legal education, dignified professions. And I don't think sales, I think sales at one point was a dignified profession. I do not know. I could not itemize where that died. And maybe it was the rise of the snake oil and the annoying style salesman, which has always existed.
1979,
We
the
will,
rise of neoconservatism.
okay, well, we will have to double click into that for sure. But what we've been tiptoeing around is that for most organizations, the customer is not important. The retention and expansion, the two things that you get from retaining salespeople, is not important. It's in the door volume. A lot of organizations that I've seen, worked with, interacted with, they just want funnel filling. They just want pipeline filling. They just want new deals. They want that MRR and ARR exceptionalism, not thinking about NRR at all, which is probably your most important of your RRs.
Absolutely.
And it's funny because executive leadership doesn't see that they are tying the knots for their own nooses in that by focusing on those short-term numbers, because that's a short-term number escape to raise valuation for those shareholders to either gut or sell off and let somebody else gut an organization. It's just it's value numbers based on customer volume, not customer delight.
Well, I think a lot of this comes down to the casino mentality, which is that the money is the house and the house always wins. But if you look at the data on private equity, 10% make it through Series A and 13% make it through Series B, which means that only 1.3% of founders see their business exit Series B when they take funding. Now, that is a bit of a travesty, and it's certainly damning because what it tells me is that founders will lose their business and probably lose their shirt. They'll be diluted out, or their baby will be slaughtered on the altar of the exit. And if it's not making the short-term growth numbers, then they will be forced to make decisions about their people, about investment in recruitment, in management, in systems, in R&D that mean that the business doesn't have longevity. And if you want to build a business that's going to last, you need to do things differently. And as we go into this changing economy, with the tariff wars going on at the moment, it's created masses of uncertainty. Supply chains are unreliable. And if the US pulls the plug in terms of policing the seas, there's 12,000 miles of sea, of which a good 6 to 7,000 in 2019 and in 2008 were manned by pirates, which means that you can't rely on supply chain continuity, reliability. It means that you then have to onshore, you have to have multiple suppliers, and the ripple effects here are significant. So I think the apprenticeship is one major symptom, but I think it really does come back down to leadership and the money behind the businesses and how their values permeate the business beneath them. And we need to be really clear. If you're a founder, you've got to make a choice about whether you grow organically, whether you grow for the long term, or whether you're going for the fast buck. Because the unicorn for most people is a myth. The best you can hope for is to raise a certain amount of capital, buy your Ferrari or whatever it is, and then discover that you're penniless and shirtless and homeless. And I think what's coming over the next 6 to 15 years is worse than anything we have seen. So in our lifetimes, 1929 to 1939 mirror almost exactly the last 10 years. And we know that didn't end well. And I think, the equivalent of the Spanish Civil War, where they were practicing modern warfare, is the Ukraine. So, we seem to be going in this generational cycle and we're not learning from history. So if you are advising boards and investors and founders and leadership, what lessons from history would you recommend that they pay good attention to so that they can thrive through this chaos?
You're asking that of a zennial, of an elder millennial, and I hate to tell you, I've got a level of disinterest and ennui for comparative history because of that, because I'm living through and have lived through those same issues. So there's no, I wouldn't say there's a feeling of helplessness. There's really just a feeling of this is the way it's going to be. How do I operate best inside of what's going to happen? And look at what pulled us out of the depression. It's not where we want to go. I think getting back onto that core topic in one of your earlier statements. So like around apprenticeship, the death of the apprenticeship, It's a correlation. It's something that we're noticing happens when people get into a panic, and these short-term investment, Series A, Series B, panicked founders, panic being the word I do intend to use, being the problem. So the panic of the way that business operates is a correlation to the death of the apprenticeship. It's a survivorship scenario, and we're having to survive at speed. So salespeople reacting to that and migrating at speed, just as organizations migrate at speed, there's not much to say about that. Founder panic. There's not a lot to say about that. It makes me think of another, like you were asking about those red flags when I go into an organization. If I'm talking to leadership in general, let's just say the CEO to the CRO, maybe the CFO involved, and they're not asking about culture issues that have been identified, process issues that have been identified, product, just simple, those high level issues. And like, let's start addressing that. And they instead go to low hanging fruit. Hey, do you see any low hanging fruit? What are some things that we can pursue right now? I just told you, culture is an issue. The product is an issue. The go-to-market strategy is an issue. The way that we invest and spend is an issue. Your low-hanging fruits are fixing the things, not going after this quick buck. So if somebody mentions the quick buck, there's a mega red flag. Anybody interviewing in an organization, if you hear low-hanging fruit or can you identify quick wins, that's you're working for panicked people. They're going to cause you to panic. And then it becomes siloed survivorship, where there is no teamwork, there is no peer counseling and coaching, and there certainly isn't leadership that will make the investment in you doing better. Yeah, I like using strong words, and you can tell me, roll your eyes again. I'm getting used to it, buddy. But,
I'm not rolling my eyes. I'm agreeing with you.
oh, there's where the eye roll's coming from. You're as disenchanted and disheartened as I am.
Well, I am. Uh, I think you need to accept the fact that you have no control over the macro. What you do have control over is the micro. You can choose your response. I responded to someone today who said, I've just fired a client because of how they made me feel.
Mhm.
Um, Again, I have to challenge that because how you feel is an act of agency if you choose to be sovereign. If, on the other hand, you abdicate control, then you can't blame somebody else for making you feel that way. Um, you had a choice. You could tell them to fuck off. You can tell them to go and boil their head, and you can confront the issue kindly, but it's a choice, and it takes discipline, it takes rigor, and it also takes a high degree of self-awareness. And I think one of the big problems that I see at the moment is there's a very low level of self-awareness. Self-awareness is understanding how others receive you and how they respond. And if you can't understand that, then chances are you're going to find yourself pointing the finger of blame a lot. And that's something else that seems to have arisen very much over the last 20, 30, 40 years, which is blame culture, avoidance. And that's tied into this silo mentality. And if we step back and we take a leaf out of Clay Christensen's book and we understand what the real job to be done is by the customer, then we can spend some time on what really matters. To deal with the pipeline issue, and the first thing I do when I go into an organization is I go to the operations team and I speak to them and I find out what it is they do excellently that customers love and would hate to be without. Once I've understood that, then I go to the sales team and I ask them how much of their pipeline actually reflects that type of opportunity. And it's never more than 20%, if it's that high at all. So they're spending 80% of their time trying to sell something that they do badly. And then they wonder why they have to churn and burn, and why they have to spend most of their time replacing customers who they should never have sold to.
This is one of those few times I get to disagree with you. The You're talking about blame culture. I think we've now stepped beyond that. Blame culture, yes, it was built over the last 30-ish years. In the last five, with rifts and layoffs and restructuring and COVID style stuff and everything, these massive changes in how we regard human capital, your favorite term, blame has gone away. Self-aware, we're all self-aware. I think everybody's more self-aware now than they've ever been before because social media stuff them also be self-conscious. And what happens?
Self-conscious, but not self-aware.
Well, and this is where I'm getting into the self-aware. People are self-aware. They think they're thriving in a role. They know they're doing a good job. They have metrics to prove it. And they have an impromptu meeting show up on their calendar Friday afternoon, Monday morning, whatever it may be, and they hop on excited thinking they're going to talk about one thing, and it's their manager and their human relations business partner, which, please, people, understand that individual works for the company. They do not work for you. Do not let their titles ever confuse you on that front. And they have the rug ripped out from underneath them. And it can be for a myriad of reasons. They give the reasons that are least likely to get them sued. They give the concession that is going to make the person complain the least. And for most people in this job environment, they've experienced it one, two, three, four times, not of their own fault or doing. And they get told this compounding problem. It's not personal. It doesn't have anything to do with you. Yet, people that you work with do similar roles to yours, do the same role as yours, are still inside the organization. So you, as someone that's thriving, confident, happy, has faith in an organization, likes the people you work with, trusts the organization, trusts your manager, then to hear that you've been plotted against for who knows how long, lied to for who knows how long, and dismissed comparatively to someone else who you are as good, if not better than. Even the best self-aware people do not hold the level of bravado that it takes to get through that on a repeat basis. We're all dying, if not dead, inside. So when we look at job listings for salespeople and everybody's saying must have an established book of business, must have 10, 15 years in the industry space, and their base plus OTE reflects someone that is just starting out, sales has become an abusable role. Marketing has always been an abusable role. Anybody in this go-to-market arena, product sales and marketing, I don't know. I don't know. And I think that's part of why there's not going to be real change makers.
There are a few out there who are really committed to this. We've set up Salesforce for Good and the seller code precisely for that. Uh, Sellers Anonymous is out there specifically for recovering salespeople who, in the same way that AA sponsors people in, we sponsor people into Sellers Anonymous, and we provide a community for people where they can learn from one another and they can learn how to weather the storm. But to build on your point, I think what tends to happen is the people who are not complicit, who are not malleable and easy to influence to do the wrong thing, they're the ones who tend to survive longer. So, I can think of a dozen people off the top of my head who were anywhere between 180 to 400+% of quota, and they get fired for pettiness. Things like not filling out the CRM or not doing a BANT discovery call when they know it doesn't work. And they get treated like a pariah by leadership because they feel threatened or because they've sold something that has a high degree of renewables. And rather than paying them what they're due, it's easier to get rid of them and cheaper to get rid of them because you've got 3 to 10 years worth of renewables. So printers, that kind of thing. And I think ethics have gone out the window. Trust has gone out the window.
Mhm.
And one of the things I've spent the last 7 years working on is how you can actually measure trust and its absence in an organization and what that does to the balance sheet, to EBIT, to MOIC, to your gross recurring revenues, your net recurring revenues. And the numbers are breathtaking. If you focus on creating a trustworthy environment and you recruit for trustworthiness and integrity, the rest you can train. But instead, we focus on ludicrous things like years of experience in an industry. Well, the data on this is absolutely empirical and categorical. The only thing experience does is speed up the ramp up period fractionally. Overall performance is not improved at all by recruiting people with experience. And I can think of several of my clients who I've helped get jobs in new industries who are at the top of their game. I've got one who's in Clary, another one in ClickUp, another one in Gong, another one in HubSpot, all of whom are in the top 4% or the top 0.8% of performers in those businesses. And they were brand new. There's another chap who is going to be our next guest on Sellers Anonymous. And he arrived in New York, new company, new product, new market, no network. And the next day, New York was locked down. And he's the number one person in his company. And then he got promoted, and his team of 2 outperforms teams of 11. So it is absolutely possible to thrive through the chaos, but you have to make a conscious choice, and you have to put the customer at the heart of everything you do, and you have to make your employees your number one customer.
So you covered a lot there. I'm going to go back to that earliest part, the checklist, which I had mentioned before, and you had just mentioned about compliance.
Mm-hmm.
And hard skill exchange, the coaching that I do most often with people looking for mobility in their role or management that's looking to be a better manager, comes to those 2 different things. You're recognized for business, and I spell that BUSYNESS. Did you do all the checklist items? Because that's what leadership's looking for. And my gut hope has always been that they want you to do that. So when something goes wrong, all those bases are covered and they can actually help you diagnose and fix.
Hmm.
But the reality that I often see is that it just is, that's what they know. And that's what they expect. If you can do the checklist and be an okay performer, they're happier with you than you being a maverick. This is in most organizations. You just laid out, I think, 6 or 7 that are contrary to that, where they want to see innovation, where they foster growth and innovation. Might not be perfect, but better than a lot of others that I've seen.
And just to make the point, that's despite their company culture. So they give voice to their values and they plant their feet because it's impossible for them to go against those value systems. They would rather be fired, but they can't fire them because they're performing so well. Now, not all of them, many of them do get fired because they're not complicit.
Yeah, but that speaks, again, I'll say that speaks to the organization, that regardless of the reason, you're being heard and retained for who you are. So I'm just going to give that a little bit of breathing room. Again, I'm not big on defending organizations or executives or anything that can have this nebulous villain cloud, but I'm going to play devil's advocate here. The other point that you hit on, my favorite time getting fired as a salesperson, the reason was, and I have this written down, I need to frame it. You are making too much.
Yep.
How awesome is that? So then, and I think what one area that we're not totally on, there seems to be this blur versus a book of business and experience. When I'm talking about organizations that literally say you need to have a book of business, they're wanting you to come in with accounts in hand. Like you should know that you're going to get churned and burned. And organizations that are looking for experience, don't have an environment of professional development culture. God forbid it's an organization that has both. Or God help that organization if they think both is okay.
We have to touch on AI because it's so prevalent. Um, let's start with a positive. How can AI be used as a force for good?
Okay, I'm going to give you 2 different contexts. I'm going to give you we'll start with the salesperson one because that's what the ask is. But then I want to give the bigger picture one. So the salesperson context is, if you understand how to use it and you set it up properly, it can be the partner and the trainer that you're not getting elsewhere. But that's a chicken egg scenario. And you can't use, a lot of the commercial models are very difficult to use because they glad hand. They're rewarded for providing an answer. They're rewarded for being positive and pushing forward. So rarely will you get an I don't know, or an I disagree with you on, or I think you could be better at. And so there is specialty prompting, there's agent building, there are these scenarios, running local LLMs and dropping transcripts in there and having your local one tuned to just be brutal with you, to be what you would expect from a manager that's really analyzing what you're doing on your day to day. Or if you're really good at prompting, looking at your ICP, looking at your ideal, not only your ideal customers, but your favorite customers. We always forget that. Like, think about who your favorite customer is. They don't have to be the ones that spend the most, or the ones that you like working with the best. Prompting against that and getting that feedback. That's a great use of AI. Here's the second part of it, though. Great salespeople that have a little technical acumen, they can build those AI things, are going to be the new rise of the new founder. I'm doing it with my Chaos Agent project. The fact that there's open source, not just open source tech like there's been since Linux, but every major commercial product out there has 3 or 4 different open source platforms competing against it. Now that hurts. For those that don't know, open source is basically like crowd built. It's actually, I think, where crowdsourcing as a term comes from, but crowd built solutions in technology. And this goes like Linux Foundation, the ARM processors, hardware is being done this way. That all these open LLM models, the ability to train your own, the ability to build LoRa's on top of those models, all these IDEs, which are the like Cursor and Bolt and
What do you mean,
these
Laura's?
things. Pardon?
What do you mean by Laura's?
So there, like, you've got your LLM models, which are the larger large language models, and then you've got different types of augmentation that can go against those, not against, eh, against. It's training, it's additional training that piggybacks onto it. So it's the
So
supercharger
it's
for your
layering.
car. Yeah, you say you have the same car, but you change the interior. You painted the walls of your house. It is some level of augmentation that you can bring to the table, own exclusively, or someone could provide to you that alters what you're working with. And in the main commercial state, agents are what a lot of people use that operates in that same kind of way. And there are just tons of them. And then the manipulation in the ways of using them. You can have Kenneth Ward, one of my favorite people. I think one of yours now. He and I are building a RAG right now to help with his customer base. And a RAG basically just is a big old bucket of documents and teaching the LLM to not hallucinate, not make things up, and not lie, understand everything that's in there, and present back an answer that's honest. Based on the technical documentation and other materials that have been provided. We've got these model to context workflows. Anyway, I'm going into this weird deep dive. Good salespeople right now have the ability to build their own thing and build it with some level of support. So when we're thinking about founder-led over the past few years has been like technical founder-led, and they've had to learn how to be salespeople. But usually it's just they learn how to play the game and they learn how to be cutthroat, as opposed to like being salespeople. Whereas now, salespeople have the opportunity to have something else help them with the technical side. And they know how to interact with the customers. They know how to interact with the market. They know how to move beyond those technical founders. I'm excited. I know you say 1929 to 1939, but I think there's going to be this rise of entrepreneurship over the next decade of people.
I hope you're right, and I don't disagree entirely. I think what I've learned from the last 2, 3 years of using AI is actually if you know how to ask questions, you can build agents and you can build really powerful models. Um, and the skill of being able to ask a question well and to nuance it and to get the answer to the question that you asked is really what you need in order to be able to build brilliant agents. Because if you start with the premise that you're building it for a particular customer who is renting a specific outcome and you work backwards, you can start creating amazing resources. So I've created assets such as, for example, a trust-based predictive hiring tool that allows us to interview and select candidates who are high on trustworthiness because I've also built a governance engine that requires people to behave with integrity and transparency. And because of that process, we're now able to create an environment where governance meets requirements that the EU, that Delaware, and all these other high standard places are holding people's feet to the fire. And off the back of that, it then creates other spin-offs. So I must have, I don't know, 20 different ecosystems I've been playing with at various stages. And the net result of that is that we can apply those models to become hyper effective in very specific contexts. So you can build your own coaching agent, you could build your own go to market agent. I think where most people are spending their focus and time is on trying to create automation to drive efficiency. If you focus on the effectiveness and efficacy side of the equation, efficiency comes later. Because actually, that's relatively straightforward. There are loads of agents out there that can take things like Lovable, and you can turn it into code. But if you don't build it on solid foundations, then all you're going to do is create yet another piece of highly copyable, extremely boring, and short-lived software. That's not what people are looking for.
And vulnerable. And I'm
And
not,
vulnerable,
yeah,
no moat.
but you're kind of, well, vulnerable in the sense that people don't know how databases work. They don't know how identity and access and authorization work. Like there's a lot of, if you haven't been in a product team, if you haven't been an engineer, I've been blessed to be across the board on everything except legal, which is funny because that's what I dropped out of school to do. Um, you're going to do it wrong. But I think you're also kind of proving my point. You're not using these tools as Marcus the salesperson. You might have built them for Marcus the salesperson, but these are part of what you've built for your community, for your crowd. What you could build as a business and a product in and of itself. Now, I don't recommend doing it with agents because you don't own your own product. Like I am pro Lovable. I love the people at Lovable. I love what they're doing. But again, that's like prototyping an MVP. Then you take it to the next stage. Agents would be the same way. You don't want to give away what you're building, but you do want to prove it works. So again, this shows the entrepreneurial avenue you could take with the things that you're building for yourself or for others.
So bringing all this together, you're showing some glimmers of optimism. I am too. I think turmoil and uncertainty are great opportunities. I look at many of the big recruitment companies because that's where I started cutting my teeth. And they started in the early 90s in a recession with £50 and a gold card. And they grew into centimillion businesses over the next 10, 15, 20 years because they started in the grist mill. In your experience, because you've been through at least 3 recessions, um, in your experience, how do individuals thrive when there is uncertainty all around and there's pressure to make decisions in double quick time with limited information where you might be facing 2 equally bad or seemingly equally bad options, but thrive through that despite the context?
So you can thrive, you can survive, or you can fail is really where it comes down to. And that goes as simple as fight, flight, or freeze. And the way to get to I always joke that I'm surviving on my way to thriving. And it's just self-awareness, dignity, and not being comparative. Don't compare yourself to others. Don't compare yourself to where you think you should be or where you should have been at a point. You wake up, you got air in your lungs, put your feet on the ground, and you take those steps forwards and you take action and you find joy in something and you commit to it. Those other options start showing up. They always say that people are more attractive when they're taking care of themselves than when they're focusing on or taking care of others. That is the case in life in general. When you're create Ken, who I mentioned before, he was making fun of me because like all of a sudden I have recruiters calling nonstop when I've committed to some projects. And he's like, choices, you make choices. And I love that double entendre. You create the choice happening and you get to decide whether you take it or not. So survive the recession by smiling, focusing on yourself, being a good person, and just keep moving, people.
So to wrap up, what advice would you give to your 23-year-old self if you'd had a chance to go back in time with a golden ticket and whisper in the idiot Peter's ear?
See, I don't ever like that question because it reminds me that I would have to mourn the loss of my children. So if we just step away from that and look at it on just a career, I hate time travel. If we just look at it on a career level, I would stick with the mantra that I had as a 23-year-old. And it comes from an old DiCaprio movie, Beaches, and I got it from Orbital Beached. And it was never refuse an invitation.
Mhm.
And if you can do that, you're I did it and I'm fine. And even if I don't have the wealth, I have the wealth of experience and storytelling from it. So there we go.
There's a book in there somewhere. Um, Interesting. I think be open to possibilities and approach adversity with an open mind. Don't just shut down and don't look at what's impossible. Look at what might be possible if you stop the catastrophizing. And um, I would recommend everybody learn about Albert Ellis's ABCDE model. I won't share it with you now, but go and look that up and start applying that in your day to day because it gives you liberty and it allows you to cut through the fog and the noise and the emotion and see things as they really are, as opposed to how we wish they were or how we believe they are, which are often completely different.
All right, tell us one caveat or just one writer onto your contract here with everybody. Everything we've just said, take the time to mourn. Like, don't just mask up and keep plodding along. If there is something to mourn, do it. If there is something to be frustrated about, do it. It's not about wild, glad-handing curiosity and momentum. It's about surviving.
Absolutely. Excellent. Peter Wheeler, thank you.
Thank you, buddy.
How can people get hold of you?
LinkedIn's always best. LinkedIn.com/in/Peter-led growth. That might change. I'm also at Revelocity, REVELOCITY.co. That's the new project, and then also Chaos Agent, and they're both very easy to find. But hit me up. I love talking to people. Oh, and Hard Skill Exchange, Julia Nimchinsky, the angel of go-to-market who introduced us. I'm on there as well as a coach.
Excellent. Peter, thanks again. So this is Marcus Cauchi signing off once again from the Inquisitor Podcast. If you found this insightful, then please like, comment, share, subscribe, and tag somebody who should have a listen. And if you're looking to get out of your own way, if you're finding yourself burning out, if you are a founder who is on the cusp of making the decision to either bring in consultants or go for funding, then feel free to reach out. No pitch, but what you will get is the ugly mirror held up, and I'll help you to make the decision that you need to make safely and productively. So in the meantime, stay safe and happy selling. Bye-bye.